Close your eyes. Think back to your history class. The textbook open on the desk in front of you, the teacher at the board, the dates to memorize and the facts to copy down, and the simplified version of the ancient world that was handed to you as though it were settled truth. Slaves built the pyramids, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, 300 Spartans held off the entire Persian army, Cleopatra was a great Egyptian beauty, the Trojan horse was a wooden horse. You wrote these things in your exercise book, you repeated them in your exams, you probably still believe most of them. Your teacher lied to you. Not deliberately, mostly. Some of these lies are so old, so deeply embedded in the tradition of how the ancient world gets taught, that the people teaching them had no idea they were wrong. Some of them were passed down from ancient sources that had their own reasons for distorting the truth. Some of them were invented by Hollywood and absorbed into popular culture so thoroughly that even the history books repeated them. And some of them, the most interesting ones, were deliberate. Propaganda invented to serve specific purposes, told and retold until the propaganda became the history. Tonight we go back to school. But this time someone is going to tell you the truth. 10 lies, 10 corrections, 10 moments where the story you were told falls apart and the more complicated, more fascinating reality takes its place. So settle in, get comfortable. A class is in session. And this time you are going to learn what actually happened. Lie 1, SLAVS built the PYRMIDS. This is probably the most persistent lie in all of ancient history education. It appears in textbooks, it appears in films, it appears in the confident assertions of people who consider themselves reasonably well-informed about the ancient world. Slaves built the pyramids. It is not true. The idea that slaves built the pyramids likely dates back to around the 5th century BC and was only debunked in the 1990s. Two things that happened around the same time are responsible for the myth. First, the Book of Exodus was completed in the 5th century BC. It stated that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, but made no mention of the pyramids or the Israelites being used as builders. Second, the Greek historian Herodotus was writing around the same time that Exodus was finished. In one of his works, he claimed that 100,000 slaves were used to build the pyramids. He did not mention the Israelites at all. This did not stop later historians from putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5. The myth was dispelled thanks to archaeological excavations of the sites near the pyramids at Giza, which began in the 1990s. The huge project started after a tourist found some grave belonging to the pyramid builders in 1990. The excavations found tombs dedicated to Egyptian citizens who had worked on the pyramids. What those tombs revealed was extraordinary. The pyramid builders were not slaves, they were paid workers, a combination of skilled craftsmen and seasonal agricultural workers who came to Giza during the periods when the Nile flood made farming impossible, contributing their labor to the state construction project. They were paid in high-quality food and tax exemptions. They received medical care. Their bones show evidence of sophisticated surgical treatment for injuries sustained during construction. Some of them had amputations that they survived, which required both medical skill and genuine care for the workers' welfare. They were buried with dignity near the pyramids they had built, with jars of beer and bread for the afterlife. The way the bodies were positioned and the proximity of the tombs to the pyramids strongly suggest these builders were not slaves. The evidence suggests they were organized into gangs with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkora, which recorded their output on the stones as they worked. These inscriptions are the closest thing we have to the voices of the pyramid builders themselves. They were not enslaved. They were workers, proud, skilled, organized, fed and cared for. Building the greatest structures in the ancient world was not something you could do with coerced, resentful slave labor working under the whip. It required organization, skill, and the willing participation of a massive workforce. The lie that slaves built the pyramids served a particular narrative, one in which ancient Egypt was a brutal, slave-driving despotism, and in which the suffering of enslaved people was the price of civilizational achievement. The truth is more interesting. The pyramids were a national project, a collective effort, the product of a society that could organize and motivate and care for tens of thousands of workers over decades. No whips required. Slide 2, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. The image is perfect, too perfect. The mad emperor, the burning city, the fiddle playing as Rome is consumed by flames that he may have started himself. Nero fiddling while Rome burned is one of the most enduring images in the popular history of ancient Rome. It is a symbol of callous indifference, of leadership that dances at the edge of catastrophe, of a ruler so depraved that the suffering of his people is entertainment. It is almost entirely fabricated. The image of Emperor Nero playing music during Rome's ruin is compelling but historically improbable. Contemporary sources reveal that the fiddle did not exist in 1st century Rome, and Nero was actually coordinating relief efforts as the city was engulfed in flames. Let us take these problems one at a time. The fiddle, the violin, was not invented until the 16th century. It did not exist in ancient Rome. Nero could not have played it because it had not been invented. What he might have played was the cithara, a type of lyre. Nero was genuinely interested in music and performance, and he played the cithara. He also sang in public, which Roman aristocratic tradition considered deeply undignified. His musical interests were real and were used against him by his enemies. But he was not playing it while Rome burned. The Great Fire of Rome broke out in July of 64 AD. Nero was at his villa in Antium, modern-day Anzio, about 35 kilometers south of Rome when the fire began. When news reached him, he returned to Rome. He opened his gardens and public buildings as shelters for the displaced population. He organized the distribution of food. He supervised the relief effort. He paid for reconstruction from the imperial treasury. This myth was deliberately spread by Nero's political enemies to discredit him and paint him as heartless and decadent. Nero was not a good emperor by any reasonable measure. He murdered his own mother. He executed people on thin pretexts. He was vain and self-indulgent in ways that genuinely damaged Roman governance. There is plenty of real material for criticism. But the fiddle story is not history. It is propaganda, invented by people who wanted to paint the worst possible picture of a man they despised, and transmitted across 2,000 years until it became one of the most recognizable images in ancient history. Your teacher taught you propaganda, now you know. Lie 300 Spartans held the pass at Thermopylae. The story is magnificent. 300 Spartans, standing alone against the might of the Persian Empire, holding the pass at Thermopylae against hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, dying to the last man, choosing death over surrender. It has been erroneously stated that 300 Spartans held the Thermopylae pass against a vast Persian army led by King Xerxes during the Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC. There were indeed 300 Spartans at the pass. They just were not alone. They were backed up by at least 4,000 allies. The full force at Thermopylae included around 7,000 Greek soldiers, Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, Arcadians, Corinthians, and others. This was a coalition force defending a common cause, not a solo Spartan stand. The Thespians deserve particular attention. When Leonidas finally dismissed most of his forces, knowing the pass was about to be outflanked, the Thespians refused to leave. 700 Thespian soldiers stayed and died alongside the 300 Spartans. They chose to stay not because their king ordered them to, but because the Persians had already destroyed their city and they had nothing to go back to. The Thespians died at Thermopylae. They are almost never mentioned. The reason the 300 Spartans story displaced the fuller truth is partly Spartan propaganda. The Spartans had a political interest in presenting the battle as their exclusive achievement, and partly the magnificent simplicity of the number. 300 has a poetic resonance that 4,000 does not. And then there is the film 300, which earned approximately $465 million at the box office and made the Battle of Thermopylae one of the most famous battles in ancient history. The movie is filled with more fiction than fact, and still enraged a number of historians with expertise in the ancient world. 300 is not even the most distorted number in the Thermopylae story. The Persian army that Xerxes brought against Greece is described in ancient sources as numbering in the millions. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 100 and 300,000, still an enormous force, but a very different scale from the millions of the ancient accounts. The story is still remarkable without the distortions. A coalition Greek force held a narrow pass for 3 days against the largest army the ancient world had assembled. They were betrayed by a local who showed the Persians a mountain path around the position. They fought to the last. It is still one of the great military stories of the ancient world. It just involved a lot more than 300 people. Life for Cleopatra was an Egyptian beauty. 2 misconceptions in one. The first, Cleopatra was extraordinarily beautiful, a supernatural seductress whose physical appearance was the source of her power over the greatest men of Rome. The second, Cleopatra was Egyptian. Both are wrong, or at least, both are considerably more complicated than the version your history class gave you. There are 2 common misconceptions about Cleopatra. First, it is widely thought that she was some sort of otherworldly beauty whose looks brought men to their knees. Second, many people believe she was Egyptian by birth. She was not Egyptian. The Ptolemaic dynasty hailed from Greece and only came to rule Egypt after the reign of Alexander the Great. The rest of her family did not even speak Egyptian. Cleopatra was the first in her family to bother learning the local language. She spoke 9 languages in total, but she was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 3 centuries to learn the language of the people she governed. Her ancestry was Macedonian Greek. The Ptolemaic royal family practiced sibling marriage, brother marrying sister, for generations, which meant that after a few generations the family gene pool was quite narrow. The idea of extraordinary physical beauty emerging from generations of close intermarriage is, to put it gently, not well supported by genetics. The ancient sources do not actually describe Cleopatra as extraordinarily beautiful in the way the legend suggests. Plutarch, our most detailed ancient source on her, says explicitly that her charm was not in her physical appearance, but in her intelligence, her voice, and the quality of her conversation. He describes her ability to switch between languages as almost musical, her manner in any situation as compelling rather than decorating. She was, by Plutarch's account, extremely compelling to be around, brilliant, witty, capable of making anyone she was talking to feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room. The accounts of her relationship with Caesar and Antony suggest genuine intellectual connection as much as physical attraction. The image of Cleopatra as the seductive Eastern queen, dangerous, beautiful, using her body to manipulate Roman men, is largely the invention of the Roman propaganda machine that Octavian deployed against her in the years before Actium. He needed to explain why the great Mark Antony had abandoned his Roman wife and his Roman values for an Egyptian queen. The answer his propaganda provided was witchcraft, sexual manipulation, the supernatural power of the dangerous East. It was not true, it was politically useful. And it has been repeated as history for 2,000 years. Lie 5, the Trojan horse was an actual wooden horse. The wooden horse is perhaps the most famous single object in all of ancient mythology. The Greeks, unable to breach the walls of Troy after 10 years of siege, concealed a force of soldiers inside a giant wooden horse and left it outside the city walls as a supposed offering to the gods. The Trojans dragged it inside. That night the soldiers emerged and opened the gates for the waiting Greek army. It is one of the great stories of the ancient world. It may also be almost entirely fictional. The legendary story of the Trojan horse entering Troy has been taken as literal truth for centuries. However, many historians now believe the tale was a metaphor or symbolic narrative, not an actual wooden structure. Ancient sources offer alternative interpretations, suggesting it may have represented siege technology or a cunning strategy rather than a tangible horse. There are several reasons for this skepticism. First, the practical problem. A wooden horse large enough to conceal a meaningful number of armed soldiers would be enormous, perhaps 10 to 15 meters tall. The Trojans, dragging this object through their city gates, apparently noticing nothing unusual about a massive hollow construction left outside their walls by the army that had been besieging them for a decade. The credulity required strains belief. Second, the symbolic problem. The horse was sacred to the god Poseidon. In Greek mythology, the sea god and earthquakes were both associated with horses. Some historians have suggested that the Trojan horse is a metaphor for an earthquake, that the walls of Troy were breached by seismic activity, which the Greeks attributed to Poseidon, and that the story of the horse was the mythological encoding of a natural disaster. Third, the siege technology theory. Some ancient sources describe siege engines of various kinds being used in the Trojan War. The horse may represent a siege tower or battering ram military technology that the poets transformed into the more dramatically satisfying image of a wooden horse. Was there a real Trojan War? Almost certainly something happened at or near the site of ancient Troy. The archaeology of the site confirms multiple periods of destruction and rebuilding that correspond roughly to the period in which the war is traditionally set. But the specific details of Homer's account, including the wooden horse, are almost certainly legendary rather than historical. The Iliad is one of the greatest works of literature ever produced. It is not a news report. Your history teacher may have presented the Trojan horse as historical fact. It is a story, a magnificent, culturally foundational story, but very probably not a literal description of how a war ended. Lie 6, the Roman salute was used in ancient Rome. This one matters more than it might appear at first. You have seen it in films about ancient Rome. The outstretched arm, rigid and straight, palm down, the Roman salute, legions raising their arms in unison before the emperor. gladiators saluting before the games, the formal gesture of Roman civic life. The so-called Roman salute, in which the arm is fully extended forwards or diagonally with palm down and fingers touching, was not used in ancient Rome. The gesture was first associated with ancient Rome in the 1784 painting The Oath of the Orator by the French artist Jacques-Louis David, which inspired later salutes, most notably the Nazi salute. Read that again. The gesture that Hollywood has given us as the authentic ancient Roman salute, the gesture that appears in every historical epic set in Rome, that has been repeated so many times it feels like established historical fact, was invented by a French painter in 1784, and then adopted by fascist movements in the 20th century, who used the apparent ancient Roman precedent to give their political gesture a veneer of historical legitimacy. There is no reliable ancient source, no ancient artwork, no archaeological evidence that the Romans used this specific gesture. Ancient Roman art shows a variety of gestures of greeting and salute, but not the rigid straight-arm forward extension of the Hollywood version. The real Roman gestures were quite different. The clasped right hand, the dextrum iunctio, was a gesture of friendship and alliance. Soldiers were depicted in various postures of salute, but not the specific extended arm that modern culture associates with Rome. The consequences of this confusion are worth noting. Nazi propagandists who adopted the gesture and associated it with ancient Roman virtue were drawing on a French painter's imagination, not on actual Roman practice. The fascist movements that wanted the historical weight of Rome behind their salute were appealing to a tradition that did not exist. History was manufactured to serve ideology, and the manufactured history became more famous than the real one. Lie 7, Tutankhamun's tomb was cursed. The curse of the pharaohs. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1922, the story that immediately captured the public imagination was not the extraordinary treasure inside, the golden mask, the nested coffins, the extraordinary array of objects preserved for 3,000 years in the sealed chamber. It was the curse. Tutankhamun's tomb is not inscribed with a curse on those who disturb it. There is no curse inscription in Tutankhamun's tomb, not on the entrance, not on the walls, not on any of the objects inside. The specific curse that newspapers reported, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king," has never been found inscribed anywhere in or near the tomb. It was invented by journalists who wanted a better story than an archaeological discovery. When Lord Carnarvon, who had funded the excavation, died in April 1923, a few months after the tomb was opened, of blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, the newspapers went into a frenzy. The curse had claimed its first victim. What actually happened to the people who entered the tomb? Howard Carter lived until 1939, 17 years after opening the tomb. He died at the age of 64 of Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is not obviously connected to ancient curses. Of the 26 people present at the formal opening of the tomb, 6 died within a decade, 20 survived for many more years. The death rate among this group was not statistically unusual for a group of people of their ages and health conditions. The story of the curse persisted because it was irresistible, the idea of an ancient power reaching across 3,000 years to protect a sleeping king. It made for extraordinary newspaper copy. It tapped into the public fascination with ancient Egypt. It made the story more dramatic. But the ancient Egyptians did sometimes include protective texts in tombs. Some tombs do have inscriptions threatening those who would desecrate them. These were religious warnings, not magical curses, appeals to the gods to punish those who violated the sanctity of the burial. Tutankhamun's tomb has none of these. The most famous archaeological discovery of the 20th century has been surrounded by a myth that was invented within months of the discovery, and that has never gone away. There was no curse. There was instead 3,000 years of human achievement waiting in the darkness, kept perfectly preserved by the dry desert air. That is a better story than any curse. Lie 8 ancient people had short life, expectancy. This one is more subtle than the others, but it shapes how we understand the ancient world in profound ways. You have probably heard the statistic: life expectancy in ancient Rome was around 25 years, in ancient Greece not much better, in ancient Egypt shorter still. If this is true, it means that the ancient world was populated almost entirely by teenagers and young adults, that the great philosophers and generals and emperors we read about were exceptional survivors in a world where most people died before they reached 30, that childhood was a brief interlude before an early grave. The statistic is not wrong exactly, but it is profoundly misleading. Life expectancy at birth in the ancient world was indeed low, somewhere between 20 and 35 years, depending on the time and place. But this figure is dragged down almost entirely by one factor: infant and child mortality. Ancient children died at terrifying rates. Perhaps 1 in 3 died before their first birthday. Perhaps half died before reaching adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, infection, accidents, the modern medical interventions that make childhood survivable simply did not exist. But if you survived childhood, if you made it past the diseases of infancy and the hazards of early childhood, your life expectancy improved dramatically. A Roman who survived to the age of 20 could expect, on average, to live into their 40s or 50s. Those who survived to 40 could expect to live into their 60s. Those who survived to 60 had a reasonable chance of reaching their 70s or beyond. We know this because we have the ancient people themselves as evidence. Plato lived to approximately 80 years old. Sophocles died at around 90. Cicero was killed at 63, not of illness but of political assassination. Augustus Caesar died at 75. The Emperor Diocletian retired at 60 and lived to approximately 68. Galen, the great Roman physician, lived to 70. The ancient world was not populated by a society of young people watching their elders die in their 30s. It was populated by a society where many children died young, a catastrophe by any measure, but where those who survived childhood could live lives of considerable length. The lie that everyone died young in the ancient world distorts our understanding of how those societies functioned. It makes us see the philosophers and senators and generals as freakish exceptions. They were not. They were the survivors of a brutal childhood mortality rate, and once they survived, they could live long lives. Lie 9. The ancient world was racially homogeneous. This lie is not usually stated explicitly in history class. It is more often implied by the images in textbooks, by the casting in films, by the way the ancient world is presented as a collection of distinct, separate civilizations, each with its own ethnically uniform population. Ancient Greece looks Greek, ancient Rome looks Roman, ancient Egypt looks Egyptian. The archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The ancient Mediterranean was one of the most cosmopolitan, ethnically diverse regions in the ancient world. The great cities of the Mediterranean, Alexandria, Rome, Carthage, Athens, Antioch, were genuinely international. People from across the known world lived, worked, traded, worshipped, and intermarried in these cities. Rome at the height of the empire had a population drawn from every corner of its territories and beyond. North Africans, Syrians, Greeks, Gauls, Britons, Germans, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, all of them present in the capital, many of them citizens, some of them holding the highest offices of state. Septimius Severus, a Roman emperor from 193 to 211 AD, was born in what is now Libya and was of North African and Punic descent. His wife Julia Domna was from Syria. Their son Caracalla became emperor in turn, an African emperor and a Syrian empress ruling the Roman world. This was not unusual. It was the natural result of centuries of conquest, trade, and migration across an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The ethnic diversity of the ancient world extended to positions of extraordinary power and cultural achievement. The Roman Empire had emperors of Spanish origin, of Illyrian origin, of Arabian origin, of African origin. The great philosopher Plotinus was probably Egyptian or Libyan. The astronomer Ptolemy was probably Egyptian. The physician Galen was from what is now Turkey. The textbook image of the ancient world as ethnically homogeneous, with each civilization neatly bounded and internally uniform, is a modern projection onto the past. It reflects modern anxieties about race and identity, not ancient reality. The ancient world was messy, mixed, complicated, and diverse in ways that make the modern world look relatively tidy by comparison. Lie 10. The ancient world was primitive compared to US. The final lie, the most pervasive, the one that underlies all the others. The idea that the ancient world was primitive, that it was a rough, brutal, limited place, populated by people who did not really understand the world they lived in, people who were on the way to becoming us, but had not arrived yet. This lie takes many forms. The ancient people believed the earth was flat. They did not. The ancient Greeks calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BC calculated it at approximately 40,000 kilometers, which is correct to within 2%. The Romans knew the earth was round. The medieval Europeans knew the earth was round. The idea that people thought the earth was flat is a myth. According to historians, it was widely known, starting in the 3rd century BCE, that the earth was not flat. The myth was intentionally popularized in the 19th century by authors seeking to portray earlier societies as ignorant and backward. The ancient people did not understand science. The ancient world produced Archimedes, who calculated pi, invented the Archimedean screw for raising water, and designed military machines of extraordinary sophistication. It produced Hipparchus, who produced the first star catalogue and calculated the precession of the equinoxes. It produced Hero of Alexandria, who invented the first steam engine, a device called the Eolipile, which he used as a toy rather than a practical machine, but which demonstrated the principle of steam power more than 1,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. The Antikythera Mechanism, a bronze device recovered from an ancient Greek shipwreck, dated to approximately 100 BC, is an astronomical calculator of breathtaking complexity. It could predict the positions of the sun and moon, the timing of eclipses, and the scheduling of the ancient Olympic Games. It has gears of extraordinary precision. Nothing of comparable complexity appeared in the archaeological record for the next 1,000 years. The ancient world was not primitive, it was different. Different materials, different energy sources, different institutional structures, different knowledge bases in some areas. But the people of the ancient world were as intelligent as we are. They were as curious, as creative, as capable of solving problems and building institutions and creating beauty. The lie that they were primitive, that history is a story of steady progress from ignorance to enlightenment, from them to us, is a lie that flatters the present at the expense of the past. The ancient world built the Parthenon and the Colosseum and the Great Pyramid and the Library of Alexandria and the aqueducts that supplied 1,000,000 people with fresh water. It produced Homer and Plato and Cicero and Virgil and texts that we still read and argue about 2,000 years later. It was not primitive. It was extraordinary. And the history class version of it, simplified, distorted, stripped of its complexity and its color and its humanity, did it a disservice that it deserved better than. And now you know a little more of the truth. A closing class DISMISSED. And so our 10 lies come to rest. The slaves who were not slaves, the fiddle that did not exist, the 300 who were actually thousands, the Egyptian queen who was Greek, the wooden horse that may never have been wooden, the Roman salute that was painted in France, the curse that was invented by journalists, the short lives that were really just deadly childhoods, the homogeneous world that was actually cosmopolitan, the primitives who calculated the circumference of the earth and built mechanical computers. The 10 lies, 10 corrections. And beneath them all, the same lesson. History is not a neutral record of what happened. It is a story told by people with purposes. Those purposes shaped which facts were emphasized and which were omitted, which stories became famous and which were forgotten, which images were allowed to stand and which were corrected. The ancient world was more complex than your history class suggested, more diverse, more sophisticated, more human. Understanding why the lies were told, whose interests they served, what purposes they fulfilled, who benefited from the simplified versions, is as important as understanding the truth that replaced them. Because the same process is still happening. History is still being simplified and distorted and shaped by the purposes of those who tell it. The ancient world just gives us the distance to see it more clearly. Let those corrections settle now, like dust in an old classroom. The paid workers drinking beer at the base of the Giza pyramid, Nero in his garden feeding the displaced population of a burning city, the 700 thespians who stayed at Thermopylae and are never mentioned, Cleopatra switching languages in a conversation, the most captivating thing about her the quality of her mind, the mechanical bronze gears of the Antikythera Mechanism turning in the dark water of the Aegean. Let the truth replace the textbook. It is better, it is richer, it is stranger and more true. And sleep, a soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.